My name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author. I've written lots of books, and I make YouTube videos about writing and stuff. So if you like that, you should subscribe. Okay, that out of the way. I want to talk about something super important, and that is getting feedback for your stories. This is a subject that I think we just don't talk about enough as writers, partially because we have this myth that writing is a really solo task. It's a deeply personal thing. And while that is true, it's not entirely true. You see, writing does require an individual to do the actual work of it. But writing is a way of capturing ideas that are universal. It's a way of capturing emotions that resonate between people. It's a way of telling stories that other people can engage with. It's really a sort of dance between the author and the reader, involving all of these other characters and maybe fantastical worlds if you're a fantasy author like I am. So how does that impact feedback? Well, it means that feedback is exceptionally important, because at the same time that we are trying to, communicate these deep and important ideas as writers, we also have to be able to sell them in order to make money. There was a day when a writer didn't have to sell their books to the public. They only had to sell their books to one person, their patron. And if their patron liked what they were doing, they would support them. They would pay them enough to be able to live. As you can imagine, there aren't many people who would just go out, find an author, and be like, I like your work. Let me give you enough money that you can just live. And even if there are those people still, because I'm sure they do exist, there aren't enough of them that all of us would have the opportunity to be authors or to be writers. And so instead, we've democratized this whole process by taking one author and having a lot of different people pay them a very little bit for their book, but that little bit adds up until it's enough for the author to live. So this has created sort of a problem where, and maybe problem is the wrong word to use for this, but it's created this situation where the work that we do is bound by the money that we make. And art is very similar in this, but the core function of this is that we can make our living by selling to a lot of different people. This is where feedback becomes tremendously important. If I want to make a living as an author, I need a lot of people to give me a little bit of money. And feedback is the mechanism by which I understand whether or not my books are getting better in a way that readers like. Because it's possible, it's entirely possible to improve as a writer and then sell less books. I know people who have done this. They've gotten better as writers in sort of an absolute sense, and their audience is just not interested in what they write anymore. And that's a really frustrating position to be in. And it leads to a false conclusion that we shouldn't get better because our audience might not like it. So that's where we need feedback. That's where we need specific feedback. Now I want to talk about something that I think is also just sort of a problem with publishing as a whole. See, writing is a skill-based activity. You might have lots of emotions, you might have lots of feelings, you might have lots of stories, you might have lots of ideas, but communicating those ideas and stories and emotions clearly with your audience is a skill, and it's a skill that you can develop over time. Like any skill that you can develop over time, it requires this process of practice, and practice requires feedback, right? So there's a necessity for a feedback loop. In traditional publishing, the way that is handled is normally through the editing process. And there's nothing wrong with this, okay? Understand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that you shouldn't go through the editing process. I'm not saying that, you shouldn't listen to editors. No, editors are really, really good at a specific thing, and that is refining stories, making stories better. But what's super important to understand is that editors operate on a set of criteria that are different than the set of criteria readers have. Okay? Two different things. The editor looks at a story and says, I think this could be better. I think we could tighten the prose. I think we could make the characters better. I think we could flesh it out. But readers don't necessarily read the way editors do. Now, occasionally you will find a really good editor who is able to read as a reader and just has a slightly more critical eye, and then also understands all of the rules of grammar and that sort of stuff, and so can make really good suggestions. And if you find that person, never let them go. But the mass majority of editors are editing for a standard that is not the same as the reader standard. Now, of course, if you're writing literary fiction, this might not apply to you. Maybe the editor is actually reading for exactly the same criteria that your readers will be. But in most fantasy, in most science fiction, the majority of readers are actually not super interested in books that meet the highest and most exacting standards of literature. They're just not. And part of the reason for that is because there's a particular cadence and tempo, a sort of headiness that so-called good writing carries. And there is a particular tempo and cadence and lightness that bad writing carries. This is why pulp writers were so popular, because most people just don't have the time or the bandwidth or the emotional energy to invest in a really serious story. But writers are trained through the trad process to write really serious stories. In the pulp world, that's not the case. And that's not to say that pulp writers were bad writers, though a lot of pulp people will read and just think to themselves, man, this is bad, right? I remember hearing this comment once from someone reading a Zane Grey book. If you're not familiar, Zane Grey was an American Western writer, and he was tremendously famous and sold a lot of books. But I remember hearing this comment as a kid, right? Somebody reading the first paragraph and then laughing almost disdainfully, right? And being like, this is just so terrible. Sure, but Zane Grey also sold millions of books, right? A lot of people just didn't care. What they were there for wasn't the writing, it was the spirit of the story. It was his descriptions, his majestic descriptions of the landscape and the nobility of the characters. That's what they were there for. They didn't care about the technicality of the writing. And so this is why it's so important for you to get feedback. It's so important for you to understand, not just from an editing point of view, how to make your writing better, but from an audience point of view, how to make your writing better. So the question is, how do we actually do that? Where do we go to find those people? And the reality is that this can be difficult, but we have an amazing tool called the internet. And the specifics of how you engage with this particular loop might be a little bit different than the way I did it, but I'm going to share what I did when I was first starting out. I had no audience. Not even my family or friends wanted to read my stuff. How did I get this kind of feedback? Feedback that I've used to sell over 1 million books. Pay close attention to this because this really does work. It does, however, require a little bit of courage. Because what I did is I started going online and I started posting my writing. Now, initially, it was a little bit hard to get specific feedback, but one of the things I would do is I would engage with every single comment that I got, and I would ask the question, hey, how do you feel about this? Is there something you think that I could do better in this particular circumstance? Sometimes I would go to other authors and be like, hey, would you mind if I gave you a single page, just one page of writing? And I'm looking specifically for you to answer this question. Is there one thing in my writing that you think I could do better? And I'm happy to do the same for you. And so I put a lot of sweat equity into this process, into asking people very specifically, what is something I can do better in this particular passage? How do you like the dialogue? Is there something about this fight scene that I could improve? How do I make this more snappy? And then I would constantly double check and triple check and quadruple check with other people to find out the same trends. Because this is the thing about feedback. Everybody's opinion is their own opinion. It is just opinion. And so just because an editor or just because a reader says, I think you should do X, Y, or Z, doesn't mean you need to do it. But when lots of people speak, when lots of people say the same things, that's when it's super important to pay attention, to understand the trend of what you're looking at. And if you have a bunch of editors who are saying, you know, your dialogue just isn't snappy enough. The beginning of this book just is lagging. Your plot isn't moving at the correct pace. Then it's important to pay attention. But if you're also getting a lot of comments from readers saying, I think this is fine and I'm really excited to see where this is going, then maybe you don't have an actual problem. Maybe the kind of reader that you're targeting with your story is totally fine with what you've written. The thing about writing is that it's always possible to improve. It's always possible to make it better. But it's also possible to make it worse. Because your voice is your voice. And you need to understand it and be true to it. Over time, as you write, you're going to find your voice. And when you really do find your voice, you'll also find readers who resonate with that voice. And it is your job as the author to cherish them and to feed them more and more and more of your writing. So I hope this has been helpful for you. I would highly recommend that if you don't have anybody to read and critique your work, you go find a website. Royal Road is a great one. Wattpad is a great one. You can go on Scribble Hub. Doesn't matter. You're going to get mean comments, but you know what? The best way to turn those mean comments into helpful comments is to engage respectfully and don't deny what the person is saying, but instead say, thank you for your feedback. What is one thing that I can do to improve in this specific instance? And you'd be surprised. A lot of my longest term fans came from people who started with leaving me mean comments. So have courage and get that feedback.